Hello, this is Carrie Nemi from the design team at Enterprise again. Welcome to Design Guidelines. What are they and does my organization need them? We are all gathered here on the line today. At the end of the webinar, you will stay muted throughout the webinar. If you have any questions or comments throughout the webinar, you can direct them to me through the chat box feature at the bottom where it says Q&A, or actually just direct all your questions to me. And right now I'm going to pass over to Ray Demers, the Director of the Design Team here at Enterprise.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. We have a really exciting webinar planned for everyone surrounding design guidelines. This is a key resource that we hear time and time again from community development folks to architects and planners, city agencies. All sorts of folks are seeking to have something that sort of brings together mission and process together into one clear document. And what we've done here today, and we're going to be sharing with you, is a really great way to get started and to plan ahead in doing that. So for those folks that are new to Enterprise, just wanted to share a little bit more about who we are and what we do. Enterprise Community Partners is a proven and powerful nonprofit that improves communities and people's lives by making well-designed homes affordable. We bring together nationwide know-how, partners, policy leadership, and investments to multiply the impact of local affordable housing development. Over our 35-year history, Enterprise has created nearly 470,000 homes, invested $28.9 billion, and touched millions of lives. So that's just a little bit about our organization. And I believe I'm on tap to, could you go to the next slide, Carrie? So I am going to turn it over to our two featured presenters today, Brita Carlson and Alexis Smith. These two fine folks helped us develop these design guidelines. A little bit more about them. Brita Carlson, project manager and design specialist, was a Rose Architectural Fellow with A Community of Friends, a nonprofit developer of permanent supportive housing in Los Angeles, California. As a Rose Fellow, Brita brought her architectural expertise to the organization, working to enhance design, sustainability, and community engagement throughout ACOF's portfolio. While with ACOF, she developed a comprehensive set of design guidelines and specification standards for the organization in an effort to improve operational efficiencies and capture institutional knowledge, serving the needs of formerly homeless individuals and families. Alexis Smith is a registered architect who most recently was a Rose Fellow with Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, a developer of affordable senior housing in Boston, Massachusetts. At JCAG, she helped ensure that JCAG's apartment units and common spaces are places where residents could age in community, regardless of their background. As part of this work, she led an organization-wide process to develop a set of guidelines that covered high-level vision down through product specification. So really, these two folks who have been in our network for a while, during their tenure as Rose Fellows, were tasked with and engaged in designing design guidelines for and with their organization. So we couldn't think of two folks more expert to convene us in this effort. With that, I will turn it over to Alexis.
And Brita.
And Brita.
Thank you, Ray. This is Brita, and just to give you a quick look at our schedule for today, we're going to give you an overview of the resource that we created to help you create design guidelines, and that's what Alexis and I have been working on with Enterprise. And then we've got a great panel of experts who have developed their own guidelines for their organizations, and will give us insight into their work and their process. And then finally, we'll have plenty of time at the end for Q&A. And so, as Carrie mentioned, go ahead and type your questions as we're going into the Q&A chat box at the right side of your screen, and we'll get to those at the end.
All right, and this is Alexis, just to go through our learning objectives for today. At the end of this hour, we're hoping that you'll be able to understand what design guidelines are and how they can be used. You'll be able to determine how to begin the process of creating your own guidelines, and you'll be able to identify what sort of content might be most useful for your organization to include in your guidelines. And now we're going to jump right into talking about the resource. So as Ray mentioned, in the past few years, there's been a growing interest in design guidelines. We've heard this from other nonprofit developers, from participants in Enterprise's Affordable Housing Design Leadership Institute, and from many other fellows and fellowship hosts. But even though we hear from a lot of people that they really want guidelines, a lot of those folks aren't sure how to go about creating them, what problems they can solve, or what they even are. And so that was the impetus for creating this resource to help folks answer those questions.
So what are design guidelines anyway? Design guidelines can be a tool that organizations can use to communicate what they expect from the design of their buildings. And they can offer recommendations for how your organization's buildings can best meet your needs and the needs of your residents. There's no one standard format for design guidelines. They can take many different forms depending on the need of your organization. And that can be from a simple Excel spreadsheet to an extensively illustrated document. What they can't do is they're not going to make major decisions for you. They're not going to be able to eliminate the need for an architect. And they're not going to solve major organizational issues. But what they can do is clearly communicate preferences to your team. They can help you streamline your design process, and they can set clear goals and priorities for your projects.
Because there are so many different things that guidelines can accomplish, it's really important to think intentionally about why you want them and what issues you want them to address so that your guidelines can meet the specific needs of your organization. There's no sense in creating a really high-level vision document if what you need is product specifications and vice versa. So this resource helps you answer that question of why you want guidelines and then walks you through the process of creating guidelines to meet those goals. It looks at expertise that different staff might be able to contribute. It will help you tailor your guidelines so that they're useful to the people who will be reading them. And it will help you think about how to meet your goals within the time and resources that you have available.
So this resource also looks at the type of content that you can include in your guidelines, and it covers some of the information that Alexis and I have commonly come across when we've been researching various forms of design guidelines. But each organization's guidelines will include different content depending on the specific goals of their organization. Some might only need one of the elements that you see here, and some organizations might find they need something else entirely. And for each of these sections, we dive into what that section can accomplish, the type of information that you can include, how much time it might take for you to develop that section, and then we also highlight some examples from groups that have included this specific type of information in their own guidelines.
And lastly, the guide includes workbook pages so that you can jumpstart your thinking and also prompt discussions within your organization. We're really excited about this piece. The exercises can be completed by just one person, but there's also guidance on how to turn a series of the exercises into a team brainstorming session if you want to have a half-day charrette. As you're working through them, you can skip to the one or two exercises that really address the subjects that are most interesting to you, but they're also structured so that if you go through and fill out the entire workbook, you'll have a really strong base for your own set of guidelines.
All right. So now we have three panelists with us today, Annie Ledbury, David Parker, and Alexis Smith, who are going to be talking about their organization's guidelines and the process that they went through to create them. And first up is Annie Ledbury, and she is with the East Bay Asian Local Development Corporation, which you may hear referred to as EBALSD. They're a nonprofit community developed organization with over 40 years of experience in building healthy, vibrant, and safe neighborhoods in Oakland and the East Bay. And Annie, in addition to leading their creative placemaking and resident engagement strategies, also works with their development team on design and health outcomes in their affordable housing projects. So I think, Annie, you've got the floor.
All right. Hi, everybody. So our process for design guidelines came up only about 6 months ago, and we wanted kind of a quick and dirty solution to create just kind of a baseline standard of quality to help standardize and create efficiency across, we have a really full development pipeline right now. Maybe that's a common thread across a lot of our audience. And we were having the same conversations over and over again with our interdepartmental teams at the beginning of projects about just what should we be specifying, what are our minimum standards, and what could we spend a little extra money on to advance our goals of healthy housing. And also, we do have this, this kind of baseline project around health and health outcomes. And so how does that actually show up in a project, especially for folks who aren't familiar with the public health goals? What are really simple, choices you can make to advance things like asthma or healthy resident spaces? So we put together kind of an Excel spreadsheet of standard appliances and fixtures, some of those specifications that Alexis and Brita were talking about, also kind of finishes, materials, thinking about adjacencies, architectural layouts, details, and a lot of this just came out of things that have worked well and not worked well for us in the past. And how's it organized? So this is kind of our big innovation that we came up with, was to be thinking about them in 3 different ways, so that way we could really capture the differences between the things that are like our property management folks really just wanted to standardize for kind of supply chain reasons and maintenance and training, and kind of having enough fridges in stock, and then some other things that were more geared towards our architects and material selection, and kind of standardizing products for health outcomes. And some of them are more aspirational, like around maybe we want to shoot a little higher in our green standards or energy, or other kind of performance that we really want to lean on our architects or challenge them to do better in certain performance goals. So this is what it looks like. It's pretty basic, but so we kind of have our tiers, and it's sortable by all these different things. The aspiration in the future is to be able to have this, as a database that's really easy. Anybody can edit it, and it doesn't have to have any special graphic design software, and that it could potentially feed into some nicer interface in the future. But for now, we're really working on what are the bones of what we want to standardize. So this is what it looks like. And the one thing that we really, we've focused a lot on, and in all of our conversations, kind of like what you would go through if you use this workbook, we're really capturing not just the products that were specified, but the reasons why, and capturing some of those stories and lessons learned from past buildings. We have a great staff that has deep experience, but it's also subject to change. So, something you hear from this design team, some other property manager may have a different feeling about it, and there's a good reason why, and those conversations are almost the most important part to capture. So, because, yeah, even if we specify this fridge today, tomorrow that one may not be available, and we may need to update. Also thinking, as we're thinking about getting into modular options and using this as a jumping off point, the range of what is available may be really different in just a few years. So capturing those reasons why will help it to live on beyond today's environment. So the other piece around this, we didn't want to have, a big, beautiful book that would need a lot of maintenance, because there's not really a dedicated person, or it's way more useful if it can live on. So it's more of a process than a finished product. So we kind of designated, so I'm kind of representing the real estate development folks and the design side, and then working closely with our property management folks to have a regular quarterly process where we revisit these things and capture new lessons and continue to capture those conversations that are already happening in a lot of our development meetings, and just have a regular structure to have it be updated and to keep it alive, so that it continues to be useful. So that's it. That's our process. Yep.
Thanks, Annie. So our next panelist is David Parker, and he is with the Preservation of Affordable Housing, which you may hear referred to as POA. And they're a national nonprofit developer, owner, and operator of more than 9,000 affordable homes. David is their Design and Building Performance Associate, working with their development team, and he also maintains POA's Basis of Design resource, which he's going to take us through now. Welcome, David. And I think we need to change the, okay. No.
Sorry, Brita, we're turning over the presenter ball to David in 1 second.
Oh. And David, if you're still on mute, you should take yourself off. Here we go.
Okay. Hello, everyone.
All good.
Let me just get my screen shared. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Sure can.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think POA, I should say that our design resource was up and running before I started, but I'm pretty sure that the reasoning behind it was pretty similar to a lot of the groups out there. Annie mentioned having the same conversation over and over, and just the drive to create standardization across the portfolio. So that's where it kind of lied. And when I arrived, we had a Excel spreadsheet, and then I was kind of tasked with turning that into PDFs, and then we finally wound up on having a website just because it was easier to share, and it was kind of always up to date. We kind of ran into the problem of people having outdated PDFs as we went, and some people were looking at information that was a year old, so that just became an issue that was evident. But I think one of the biggest things that the basis of design, we call it the basis of design, is that it's trying to tie the development staff with our property staff. Typically, our development staff, they have a bigger budget and they can put in fancier stuff, and then about 5 years later in the building's life, when the property staff is managing it, they've got to keep up with that. So something what we're trying to do is kind of temper development staff's expectations and then tie them to real durability and real products that our maintenance staff know work well. And it's really meant to be a resource that has everyone's best knowledge. It's never, in my mind, it's never going to be perfect, and there's a lot of opinions that kind of float around creating design standards, and everyone's experience is different, and sometimes you kind of have to drill down a little deeper into why people have certain opinions about certain products or systems. So it's kind of like our best shot, but it is a tool, and the beauty of it is it'll never be perfect, and it'll never match every single property or new development, but it is a starting point for a lot of conversations. In my mind, it's something that gets our development staff, our architects, our contractors about like 85% there, and then the nuanced conversations can begin about what climate they're in, or where the property setbacks are, or those other conversations that we're not going to be able to account for in the basis of design. And it also just kind of provides like confidence for our property staff, where a lot of them aren't trained in building design or construction, so they can kind of open a resource and know that they have essentially like permission from the company to move forward with certain products. So I can take a stab at running you guys through it. I'll try to move slowly so it's not glitchy. So we created a website. You can come in and land at it. I'll start with the unit finish options. I think this is really where the basis of design began. We had these physical boards that we brought to properties years ago, and we would show them samples of cabinetry and flooring and say that here are some options that we want you guys to use so that we can create a standard unit finish selection across our portfolio. So we've got cabinetry, countertop options, paint, and these are some while there's options within this selection, these are kind of product-specific specifications where we're saying there's not a lot of wiggle room here. We want you to use this flooring in one of these 3 colors or these paint colors because we know they work well. We've picked, for example, with the paint, we've picked a durable paint that lasts long and is easy to clean. So that one is more like a product specification. And then we also have other specifications that are more performance-based. So I'll run you through some of our appliances. So I'll look at a refrigerator. And these are performance-based, which means as long as you hit this list, it's good in our mind. But we also provide a sample product just so people can come in. They can copy-paste a manufacturer number into their like their Wilmar or HD Supply portal and then search the product and have it show up. So that is the basis of design as it stands right now.
Great, thank you. Thanks, David. And then finally today, Alexis is going to share her work as a Rose Fellow with the Jewish Community Housing for the Elderly, or JCHE. And they are a developer of affordable housing in Boston. And during Alexis's time with them, she led an organization-wide process to develop a comprehensive set of design guidelines, which is a little bit different than the 2 guidelines. So welcome, Alexis.
Great, thanks. So at JCHE, we had a couple of different reasons for creating guidelines. The first was big picture. We wanted to articulate our vision and express how our mission is translated into what we build. We had just started a brand new real estate department within the past few years, and we really wanted to be intentional about making sure that who we are as an organization was reflected in our buildings. We also had reasons more similar to what Annie and David talked about. We made hundreds of decisions about design preferences on recent projects, and there was also a lot of internal knowledge within our organization about what worked and what didn't work for our residents. And even though our real estate department was new, we already didn't want to have to be reinventing the wheel with each project, and we were hoping that guidelines would really streamline our process in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our process. For 2 years leading up to starting the guidelines, I went to most of our meetings where we talked about finishes, why we wanted something, why something didn't work for seniors, and took notes and just sort of began keeping a running database about our preferences. And then once I really started to get into the thick of things, I met several times with teams across all of our sites and probably a half dozen different departments, even with a handful of residents, to sit down and have a conversation with them about what is working in your buildings, what doesn't work for you, what would you change, what do you love about being here. And then I pulled all this into a set of recommendations. So we're in the format that it took kind of changed, evolved over time, but eventually we landed at this format. We started off with our vision and principles, which were, we identified 8 different high-level things that we wanted to see in all of our buildings. And again, this just gets back to our first goal of really articulating how our mission is reflected in our buildings, and a high-level summary of priorities and how we want our buildings to feel and function. You know, what should be your reaction when you step through one of our doors? Then from there, we moved on to unit layout. We went room by room and gave a description of more specific program elements, such as, we prefer galley kitchens, and all bathrooms should have walk-in showers rather than bathtubs. Remember, we're building for seniors, and so there are a lot of very specific needs associated with that population. In this section, we generally stuck to pieces of information that architects would need to know in the early stages of designing a project. So this is where the architect goes when they first are starting off in preliminary design and needs to know how big the bathroom needs to be, what needs to be next to the kitchen, that sort of information. And then we did the same thing for the common spaces. Again, in senior housing, we have a lot of common spaces. We did the same sort of thing. We went through all of the rooms that we might provide as common space and talked about what these rooms need to accommodate. Things like, you know, the multi-purpose room needs to be able to house these many people, or at the building entrance you should be providing seating for seniors who are waiting for rides to pick them up. So that's, again, this is all kind of high-level stuff that talks about the building layout and adjacencies and the relationships of spaces. From there, we got a little bit more detailed, and this is kind of a narrative version of what Annie and David have shown. This is the specification piece. This is information on a specific product or materials or methods. In our case, it's mostly performance-based. Things like the windows need to be easily operable with minimal force, or, you know, we want overhead lighting in these locations, we want task lighting in these locations, and the fixtures need to be this many lumens. So this is where an architect would go once they've got, once they're in design development and are beginning to start to specify products. And so our document is a PDF format. One of the challenges we will have moving forward is how to keep it updated, but we're working on that. And I think from here we're going to move ahead and start taking questions from folks.
Yeah, so we're going to open out for questions, and as a reminder, you can submit questions in the Q&A box at the bottom on the right-hand side of your screen. We've got plenty of time, but we want to start. I'll start off with a question for us.
We do have a question here for David. David, how long did it take to go from the idea of a design guidelines website to the final usable public site? What kind of resources were needed to make this happen?
Well, that's a tricky thing to answer because it's depending on how much information you've already pulled together before you kind of make the decision that you want to go to a website. We had some PDF versions and an Excel spreadsheet that had a lot of information in it. So from that standpoint, it was pretty straightforward and kind of quick to move those. In my mind, they're almost like little research projects. So to move those research projects into the website format, that was pretty quick. But when it comes to researching new products, or researching new categories, I should say, that's where the time is in my mind. Creating the web page I use Squarespace, so it's very simple and very straightforward and intuitive. So it only takes maybe an hour or two to create a new page once you have the information.
Thank you so much, David. That's really awesome. I think a lot of people have a lot of hunger to find out how do we practically implement some of these things. And I think in that same role or note, we have a question for Alexis. What is the role of community members and residents in the development of guidelines?
Yeah, that's great. You can invite residents and community members in, whatever capacity or whatever extent you think that's important. At my organization, we involved the residents because the residents are the real experts. They're the ones living there, and they're the ones who know what it's like to be living in our units. As you know, when we're designing for seniors, as much as I can research best practices, when it comes down to it, the seniors are the ones who know how difficult it is to try to open a door that might be too heavy or to use a particular faucet. And so at each of the sites we sat down, at each of our buildings, we worked with our resident service coordinators to recruit a group of residents to come down and just chat with us about what they liked and what they didn't like about the buildings and about their units and about the buildings that they were living in. And it was the tricky part about that was making sure that they understood we're not going to actually make changes in your unit. We're soliciting a broader level of input so that for the next buildings we build, they can be more responsive to your needs. And they were pretty lively discussions. They definitely informed a couple of key pieces of the guidelines that we wouldn't have arrived at without them. And it was also very great for me personally to be touching base with them and remembering who the work is ultimately for.
Annie, do you have anything you'd want to add on that question?
Yeah, it's funny because I spend most of my time engaging residents, but on this project we haven't really gotten to that stage yet. I think it's really impressive, Alexis's breadth that she was able to really bring a lot of different voices in, and I think it shows in the results. For us, it's really, we kind of have been leaning on our property management staff and even our resident services to kind of bring back the thoughts of residents to our process, but I think we should be more intentional about how do we engage people on what qualities that they want in their buildings.
And actually, I should add in, two of the exercises in the resource are a list of questions that you can ask to residents or to site staff to begin to prompt your thinking about how to reach out to them.
Cool. Oh, well, I'll definitely use that.
I have a question here for Annie. I'm really excited about developing design guidelines. Do you think it starts more from a bottom-up approach or from the top-down in the organization?
I think the impetus for it has to come from the top. There has to be kind of a will, because it does require this kind of interdepartmental, everyone pulling together to raise the level of quality, and also some of that early goal setting really should be from a higher level in the organization, whether that's the heads of departments. But then it also, so once the kind of will has been set and those larger goals and kind of the scope of the design guidelines, this is what we found, is that then you start going from below and really getting into the granular level of what's the experience of people maintaining the buildings, where, looking at old work orders of what are the most the trouble products. And asking the people who have to repair and deal with them every day, because that's where the really good information comes from. So I think it's both, but I think the first, the big move has to come from the top, because it is a process, and it does take dedicated time, and it takes more time than you'd think, but it's worth it because it saves the time in the end.
Thank you so much for digging in on that. And we have another question here, and I'm actually going to put this one back to Brita, one of our other co-authors of the guide that's coming out soon to help developers think about what they might want to include. And the question is, can you repeat what some of the limitations are to design guidelines?
Yeah, I think that, what we talked about with guidelines not being able to make decisions for you, and they're not going to eliminate your need for an architect. So just because you outline everything you kind of want or have needs for in your projects, you're not going to be able to eliminate kind of the added support and design expertise that an architect has. And it's not going to solve major organizational issues, but it will. We really do find that it helps as a communication tool. And I think, like David had said earlier, it gets you into a conversation that's maybe 85% there if you have that tool that's been extensively developed in the way that POA has developed theirs. But it's not going to get you all the way. It's not going to solve all of your design problems for every building that you have going forward.
And I think building off of that on a really similar note about the limitations of design guidelines, we had a really interesting question. When creating guidelines for affordable housing, was any historical research done about past guidelines? For example, in the 1940s, there were guidelines for designing public housing units. It'd be interesting to see the differences today. And I think this, drives up, once again, the limitations and how many guidelines do you want? What are you guiding? I think that there has been some learning done from the history. So, Alexis, maybe you could speak a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. And this is referencing throughout, I think even beginning before the 40s, the federal government put out guidelines for the construction of public housing that were, initially pretty loose and benign in the 30s, but then as the federal government progressed through the 40s and 50s and 60s, became more and more restrictive and were, for a large part, ultimately responsible for a lot of the infamous public housing projects that we all know of. And so I think that's a good example of perhaps leaving room for your design team and your architects in your guidelines. Your organization and your staff are going to be the people who best know how to serve your residents, but there also needs to be, and in some ways, that's bringing in the human aspect of what you're doing in the housing that you're building that to a large extent was not present in those guidelines from the 50s. So that's, making sure that your residents' perspective is represented. And then there's also leaving room for creativity and not having your guidelines be so prescriptive. I mean, some of those later guidelines from the 50s were, down to the square foot of what you could provide, and also down to the cent of how much you could spend on certain materials. And that just didn't leave room for a whole lot of leeway when there were innovations, or more importantly, when something wasn't working. And so just being flexible and thinking about how your guidelines can continue to respond as your site managers come back and say, hey, this building is great, but there's this one room that's not meeting our needs, or as your architects come back and say, this product is getting outdated, let's think about how we can innovate here.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think it's, I think in some ways, this is Ray, and I don't mean to editorialize, but I've been working on the green building criteria, the enterprise green communities, for a while, and I think the thing that these guidelines are really great at is creating a process around how to start to think about design and decisions early and quickly, and to not get caught up in some of the minutia of spec books and documentation. I think you're looking at designing for the 80% or the 90%. You're not going to design for 100% of conditions in every case. So it's just really looking to make decisions more rapidly with a little bit more confidence. Yeah. We're still open to questions here. Yeah, David.
Oh, yeah, I just had something to add to that, which was, I don't know what the level of reporting was back then, but to Annie's point, with the new technology and having like extensive work orders that you can track, that is really kind of a roadmap into what, like, setting priorities for creating design guidelines, as well as looking at utility data that can kind of steer where, from a monetary standpoint, where you as an organization should focus. So just wanted to add that.
So we had one question about whether the flowchart and worksheets would be available for attendees. Within the next week, we'll be releasing the resource that we included. And actually, so it's a great opportunity to ask Brita and then maybe Alexis what their favorite part or favorite resource was. There's a worksheet really that walks you through every single part of creating guidelines that you can really opt in or opt out of, really with this idea that every set of guidelines is going to be unique to the organization and their needs. So I'd be interested and excited to hear first from Brita and then from Alexis what their favorite portion or piece of the guide, or one of the many, I'm sure. So Brita, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I think, we were just talking the other day about both Alexis and I went through probably a year-plus long process of creating design guidelines. And as we kind of were completing this resource, I think to myself, I wish I would have had, these worksheets or this information or this outline of, what could be included or what is typically included, because it would have been incredibly helpful for me going through. So that was a really exciting moment. And I think the unique part of having the worksheets and being able to just kind of start thinking about each particular section and have somebody walking you through what you might include, what you might be thinking about quickly in filling out a worksheet and exercise. As you're beginning the process, you're kind of left with this outline for your own guidelines at the end of the workbook. So that's been really exciting to work on and to include.
Yeah, and I'll just add one of my favorite pieces, and I think a piece that would have been very useful to me starting out was honestly, we haven't talked about this yet, but at the end of the workbook, there's a list of resources that we looked at when we were trying to figure out what our design guidelines should look like. It's such a big ephemeral term, and it can be so many different things that just having a dozen different examples to quickly page through would have been really helpful to say, oh, this group focused on this and this group focused on this, and I definitely want this for our organization. So if you're not sure what they, how you want to make them look for your organization, I definitely recommend looking at other ones that are already out there, and that's in the back of the workbook.
Thanks, Alexis. Coming back, we've got a flurry of questions coming in. We're processing them right now. I have a question about taking this and moving it into implementation. So it's for all panelists. Have any of you dealt with the purchasing and procurement requirements, i.e. the challenges posed by having to get multiple bids or ensuring your organization isn't only buying from one place or vendor?
David, want to take that?
Yeah, I can. Am I muted? No, I'm on.
Yeah, you're good.
I never know these days. So it's depending on certain project or on the, let me back up. If we are doing like a re-siding or that kind of level of scope, we have to bid it out to 3 people. But for the smaller kind of ongoing property management purchasing, that we don't bid out. And I'm not exactly an expert in how we got to that point, but we have select vendors that we use, and primarily Wilmar and HD Supply. So that was kind of bring that back kind of to the design guidelines. Everything that we put into our basis of design is trying to come from either Wilmar or HD Supply, so that it's the same product that's going in on development, and it's the same product that is being upkept from the property side. I don't know if any other organizations have information on how they're getting around multiple bids for simple purchasing.
We're not there because we didn't specify specific products. Ours is more of a performance-based, so that wasn't that's one advantage. That wasn't an issue for us. That's one advantage of not doing the product specification.
I have a question for all 3 of our panelists. You guys presented very complex documents. Each of you, really took this on over a long period of time. But what, if you had to recommend to people where to start, one simple thing that they could really do to start this process in maybe an hour a week, or where would you recommend to get started? Because this could seem a little overwhelming. Annie, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So part of the reason we have the tiers is because it's kind of the simplest to the more complex. So we really tackled our tier 1. So our kind of working directly with property management, looking at work orders, and thinking about what do we want standardized in every unit down to the model number, right? So so we started with that because it was very concrete, and it was almost it has a different audience almost than the more geared towards the architect and more open specs or performance specs. So it was, we were able to get that launched in less than 2 months with just a series of meetings, really just between property management and some people from the development staff. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit, and then it kind of sets up the process. You know, just gets the relationships going with the different decision makers, and then you can kind of roll into the things that are a little more complicated, a little more contentious, things that maybe residents might have more input into over time. So that's what we did, and it worked out well for us.
Yeah, and I can just jump in and say, I think I'd mentioned this before, but I really just started by meetings that I was attending already. Anytime someone mentioned, oh, geez, the residents are always installing their own hooks in the kitchen and it's really banging up our wallboard, I just started keeping a Word document of anything like that. Like, oh, that's something that we can fix with design if we just install our own wall hooks in the place where the residents need them. And so literally it took for 2 years, I was just keeping notes like that, and it took that long for us to really get the momentum going for us to be able to start, but then, or to start in earnest with a substantial amount of time dedicated to this. But it meant that when I did start, I had a lot of knowledge that was already collected. And it gave me a lot more street cred when I went to talk to our site staff, because I could say, oh, I've heard that, you know, residents installing their own fixes is a really big issue for you, and people were already feeling like they'd been heard, which was a nice way to build a rapport with the folks who I was getting input from. So start small, even if it's just starting to take notes. Just get started.
Annie, any thoughts on this one?
Annie, we didn't hear from David, but David, I don't know if you have thoughts on where to start.
Yeah, I mean, I would just another avenue is looking at like a year's worth of spending from the property management side and a year's worth of work orders, and just let those kind of steer, have the conversations with the property management staff, whether or not that's like the director of maintenance or the property managers or the maintenance supervisors, but also like show up with, here's what the spending says, and here's what the work orders say, and do you guys agree that these are recurring issues in your properties, and do you have feedback on how we can create a standard around them?
That's a really interesting way to think through it. Starting with what the data you already have on hand is really interesting.
Yeah.
Trying to interpolate. Yeah, go ahead. No. Oh,
no. I was just going to reiterate that there's, when it comes to creating design standards, there's a lot of, to put it lightly, a lot of opinions about all of it. And whenever you can base it on historic data, just to kind of get everyone focused on what the issues are that are in front of you, I just think it's very helpful to get the conversation started.
And I would just add that it's good so you could keep working and developing these forever, right? But that the decisions that you've already made can be put into place sooner and be making a difference in the operation of the buildings and the new buildings. So one hiccup that we had was, you know, we went through maybe 20 different items and we came to agreement on them, but they're kind of waiting for this issuance of design standards. And so that was a big push, was just to say, let's just release these ones and then let's implement a process to continue to add and to update, and being open to saying, you know, it's never going to be done, it's never going to be perfect, but let's start with this and then like have a way to keep it alive over time, because the perfect is the enemy of the good, right?
Yeah, certainly can be with this.
I was going to say we did exactly that. About a year ago, we launched the website out, and the kind of the rollout of the resource is like a whole nother topic that is challenging, kind of getting everyone up to speed on it. But now that a year has passed and people have been using it, we've started meeting with the properties and as well as the development staff. And actually last week we just met with some of our architects who have used the resource. So right now we're kind of entering like quote unquote phase 2 of what our resource is, and for the second time kind of gathering feedback on what the resource has been, knowing that it's not perfect. So to Annie's point, yeah, don't let perfect be the enemy of good.
Yeah, good point. Good point, David. Okay, we're trying to plow through a few questions here as we wrap towards the end of the hour. I wonder if any of the panelists have a quick feeling on what role within an organization is best equipped to lead or oversee or begin or sort of house the development of design guidelines. Is there an ideal position or person?
And maybe, Brita, you could take a stab at that first as one of our co-authors here.
Sure. I think, you know, for us, it was kind of shared between our real estate development team and our property management team, since those were going to be either the users or the people that were kind of keeping up the guidelines. And I think that seems like a natural place for most organizations. I think it can kind of depend on what the goals of your guidelines are and how you intend to use them going forward. But a lot of the people that we've talked to have housed, and I think all of our panelists, although I'm not sure 100% for everybody, that's kind of where they've lived for their organizations too, is in the real estate development and the property management teams.
Good feedback. Let me see if I can sneak one or maybe two more in. This question's getting towards the implementation side, so actually using the design guidelines to make some decisions. How is the interaction between the operations, the maintenance staff and the design guidelines, and how do they ever need to change, alter, or update their practices when using it to either at a unit turn or perhaps just replacing certain materials?
David or Annie, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. I think the buy-in has been really strong, but I think I think Alexis said it, like, it's not perfect and you need a little, like, quote unquote street cred when you introduce it to them. So letting them know that their feedback is going to get folded into, like, edits to the document, and it's trying to be the best knowledge of everyone, and then handed upstream to development, and then it eventually will make its way back downstream to another maintenance supervisor at a property. Then they kind of get it and they understand that we're all on the same page. But when it comes to kind of getting them to change their ways, I think it's always the same with anyone. You kind of compliment them on what's going well, and then also just try to focus in on some of the areas that there's room for improvement. And some of it, from our end, it was a lot of like flooring, and this is like very specific, but we're trying to compartmentalize our units from one another. So it's like removing the air penetrations from one unit to another. So kind of talking through like flooring installation and the process, as well as some of the things that we do when we meet with our property staff is we go to the like storage supply room and we just take a look at all of their light bulbs, as well as their aerators, and just say like, this is good, but you could do better, and here's how, and I'll send you a document, and like, let's be in touch 2 weeks from now and let me know any questions you have. So I think that, well, I guess what I'm really getting at is just trying to create the relationship and like put yourself on their team instead of being someone who's trying to like mandate something that they don't necessarily support.
And I'll also add, in kind of doing our guidelines and hearing from other people, including Annie, I think may have mentioned, that incorporating the why behind your reasoning of what you're choosing or what you're requiring from either your property managers or your architects or whoever you're handing out your design guidelines to is really important because as things change, you know, you can then base your decisions off of the why if a product's not available or if something just isn't working for a particular building. You have the understanding in the background of why some decision was made and incorporated into your guidelines.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. And actually it gets to the next question we were going to ask, but I think you just asked it or answered it. How do you keep design guidelines relevant and applicable for the duration of a project or several projects when it takes a long time to move from design through construction into occupancy? But I think that you actually just covered it there by talking about it's really about the principles and the way decisions were made around the selection of materials, that updating it afterwards is a lot easier when you know the principles that led you to select a certain VCT or a certain carpet or a certain wallboard in advance. Carrie, I'll turn it over to you to close us out.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we're really excited. Thank you to all of our panelists, and a really special thank you to Alexis and Brita for this forthcoming resource and all the interviews and time that you put in to really create something that we've heard this need from the field. And obviously, you know, I don't think we've had a webinar with this many questions for a long time. So I think we hit on a real hot button issue. So just thank you to both of you for generating such a wonderful conversation today. The resource, it will be up on the design leadership page. If you check back by next Friday, it should be up there. And just thank you all so much for joining us and really creating such a stimulating conversation with all of your questions. It made for a really interesting hour. So thank you, everyone, and we're going to end the webinar.